The deepest stories aren't always told aloud. They live in the silence of a wooden house, in the buzz of insects on a summer night in Alabama, in the gaze of a grandmother who carries the weight of a lifetime. The story of Martha Collins is one of these, and if you, like her, believe that every life holds a secret worth hearing, consider subscribing to our channel. That way, you won't miss any of the truths that insist on surfacing, no matter how hard we try to bury them. Now, let's return to that kitchen, to that night that changed everything. Sweat ran down Martha Collins' forehead, mixing with the silent tears she refused to shed. The worn linoleum of the kitchen floor was cold against her knees. Outside, the night in Cedar Grove, Alabama, was a pitch black, punctuated only by the incessant song of the crickets, indifferent witnesses to her ordeal. Each contraction was a wave of fire that split her in two, a divine punishment she accepted in penance. At 58 years old, her body, which had already brought 2 daughters into the world and helped deliver countless other neighborhood children, was now fighting its most secret and solitary battle. There was no one to hold her hand, no one to wipe her brow with a damp cloth. There was only the sound of her own ragged breath and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, marking the seconds of her shame. She bit down on a dish towel to stifle a moan that threatened to escape. The townspeople knew her as Miss Martha, the midwife, the woman of faith, the honorable widow who had raised her daughters with a firm hand and a righteous heart. If they knew what was happening within these 4 walls, the image she had spent a lifetime building would shatter like glass. Another wave of pain, stronger, sharper. She doubled over, her body trembling uncontrollably. Loneliness was her accomplice and her torturer. For 9 months, she had hidden the fruit of her sin under loose dresses and the excuse of age-related swelling. 9 months of furtive glances in the mirror, of whispered prayers in the dark, asking God for a miracle or for oblivion. Neither came. Then, amid a final push that stole her breath and her consciousness for an instant, came relief. A heavy silence filled the kitchen, so dense it was almost palpable. For one terrifying second, Martha thought it had all ended there, that the child had not survived its clandestine birth. Fear, colder than any pain, seized her. And then, a fragile, hesitant sound, a small whimper that cut through the night like a blade, the cry of a newborn. Martha crawled across the floor, exhausted, and picked up the small, trembling body. It was a girl, perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and skin the same olive tone as her own. But the eyes, when they opened for a brief moment, were not hers. They were his, eyes of a grayish blue, the color of the sky before a storm. In that instant, holding the living proof of her weakness and her forbidden love, Martha Collins knew that her secret had not died with the end of the pregnancy. It had just been born, and that child's cry was not a sound of life, but the eternal echo of her fall. The world, which had once seemed vast and full of clear rules, shrank to the size of that kitchen, and in that small universe of pain and tenderness, she felt that the judgment of God and men had finally swallowed her whole. To understand the depth of that night, one had to know the woman kneeling on the kitchen floor. Martha Collins wasn't just a woman. She was an institution in Cedar Grove. Her house, a simple white wooden structure with a long front porch, stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was there that people came for advice, for herbal remedies, or for the experienced touch of a midwife who trusted intuition and the wisdom of nature more than the distant hospitals in the big city. She was 78 in the memory we recount, but the story of her fall began 20 years earlier, at 58. By then, she had long been a widow in her heart. Her husband, James Collins, a man of easy laughter and empty promises, had left her decades before, heading to Birmingham for a job and a younger woman, leaving Martha behind with their 2 small daughters, Nancy and Teresa. Martha did not bend. She hardened. She became both father and mother, provider and counselor. She worked from sunrise to sunset, in her garden and in the homes of others, ensuring her girls had food to eat and clothes to wear. She raised them with a mix of Southern rigor and deep love, teaching them to be strong, independent, and above all, to fear God and the opinion of the community. Nancy, the eldest, was pragmatic and serious, marrying a local farmer early and moving to the other side of the county. Teresa, the youngest, was the dreamer, with a kind heart and a tendency to see the good in everyone, which Martha secretly considered a dangerous weakness. Martha's life was a routine of work, church on Sundays, and porch chats with neighbors. Her world was small but orderly. She found solace in her plants, in the radio that played soft country music in the kitchen, and in the immaculate reputation she had built. She was Miss Martha, a pillar of moral righteousness, in a town where reputation was everything. Loneliness was a constant companion, but she accepted it as part of her fate, a silent cross she bore with dignity. She didn't need a man, she told herself, and anyone who would listen. Her heart, she believed, had closed itself to love and desire the day James shut the front door for the last time. But the human heart is treacherous soil. Even the most arid and neglected ground can, under the right rain, sprout the most unexpected and dangerous of flowers. And the rain, in Martha's case, came in the form of a polite young man with a sad smile and eyes the color of the sky before a storm. He was brought by the hand of her youngest daughter, Teresa, and his name was Andrew Miller. Teresa met Andrew Miller in Montgomery, where she was taking a secretarial course. He was from Atlanta, a big city man who seemed out of place in the slow rhythm of Alabama. He worked as a sales representative for an agricultural equipment company, a job that had him constantly traveling down back roads and through small towns like Cedar Grove. He was older than Teresa, nearing 30, and carried an aura of melancholy that Teresa's optimistic nature found irresistible. To her, he was a man of the world, sophisticated and mysterious. To Martha, who saw him for the first time on her porch on a stuffy Sunday afternoon, he was a closed book, written in a language she didn't understand. "Mother, this is Andrew," Teresa said, her face flushed with pride and nervousness. Andrew extended his hand. It was a soft hand, unlike the calloused hands of the countrymen Martha knew. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Collins. Teresa speaks so highly of you." His voice was calm, polished, without the heavy accent of the deep South. He was tall, with brown hair that fell across his forehead, and those grayish-blue eyes that seemed to see more than they showed. There was a decency in his bearing, but also a restlessness, as if he were always looking for an exit. Martha sized him up with the critical eye of a mother and a midwife. She saw the way Teresa looked at him, with a blind adoration that worried her. She saw the way he smiled at Teresa, a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was a sadness in him, a void that not even her daughter's love seemed to fill. In the following months, Andrew became a constant presence. He married Teresa in a simple ceremony at the local Baptist church, and due to financial reasons, and Teresa's insistence on not leaving her aging mother alone, they moved into Martha's wooden house. The house, which for so many years had been a sanctuary of silence and female routine, now held a male presence. Andrew's shoes were by the door, his briefcase in the corner of the living room, the scent of his aftershave lingering in the bathroom in the mornings. Martha tried to keep her distance, treating him with the cordiality reserved for a son-in-law, but it was hard to ignore him. Teresa worked part-time at the town grocery store, and Andrew, when not traveling, spent long hours at home, and Martha was always there, tending the garden, cooking, mending clothes. The silence between them was at first awkward. Then, it became something else, a space filled with unspoken words. It all began on warm afternoons, on the front porch. The Alabama sun would set slowly, painting the sky orange and purple, and the heat of the day would give way to a gentle breeze that swayed the moss in the oaks. Teresa was often in the kitchen preparing dinner or visiting friends, and Martha and Andrew would be left alone, sitting in the wicker rocking chairs, the creak of the wood breaking the silence. At first, the conversations were trivial: the weather, the neighbor's corn harvest, Andrew's business, but little by little, the barriers began to crumble. Andrew, perhaps feeling like a stranger in this land, began to open up. He spoke of his childhood in Atlanta, of absent parents, of a feeling of never belonging anywhere. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just passing through everywhere, Miss Martha," he confessed one evening, staring into the darkness that swallowed the road. "Even in my own life." Martha, who knew well the feeling of being left behind, felt a pang of empathy. For the first time, she saw him not as her daughter's husband, but as a lonely man, as lost as she had felt for years, and she, in turn, began to share fragments of her own story. Not the pain of abandonment, but the small joys, the smell of the earth after rain, the satisfaction of seeing a plant grow, the stories of the children she had helped bring into the world. They discovered a shared loneliness. Martha's was a loneliness forged by time and loss. Andrew's was an existential loneliness, that of someone who had never found his place in the world. In those moments, In the twilight of the porch, they were not mother-in-law and son-in-law. They were just two weary souls, finding an unexpected refuge in each other's company. Their gazes began to linger a second too long. An accidental brush of hands while reaching for a glass of iced tea seemed to carry a strange electricity. Martha felt her heart, an organ she had deemed dormant, give small, frightened flutters. She chastised herself, told herself she was a foolish old woman, that she was confusing compassion with something more. She pushed the thoughts away, burying them under layers of prayers and hard work, but they always returned, like stubborn weeds, sprouting in the cracks of her loneliness. The danger was no longer outside. It was right there, rocking gently in the chair beside her, with his sad eyes and his need to be understood. The sky was a sickly yellow that August afternoon. The air grew heavy, dense, and the chirping of insects ceased abruptly, as if nature itself were holding its breath. A storm of the kind only the South knows was brewing on the horizon. Teresa had gone to Montgomery with Nancy to buy baby clothes for one of her sister's children and was staying overnight. The house was quiet, occupied only by Martha and Andrew. When the rain came, it wasn't gentle. It was a violent downpour that lashed the tin roof and turned the yard into a river of mud. The wind howled like a wounded animal, shaking the old oaks. The lights flickered twice and went out, plunging the house into a profound darkness, broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning. "Power's out," Andrew said, his voice sounding unnervingly close in the dark. "It happens," Martha replied, her own voice a little shaky. She got up to find candles in a kitchen drawer, her hands fumbling in the darkness. Andrew followed her, and a flash of lightning illuminated his face for an instant. His expression held a vulnerability she had never seen before. The storm outside seemed to mirror a storm within him. "I hate thunder," he admitted, almost in a whisper. "Since I was a kid." Martha found the candles and a match. When she lit the first one, the dancing flame cast long, trembling shadows across the kitchen. She turned to him and saw it wasn't just the storm. There were unshed tears in his eyes. "What is it, son?" she asked, the word son coming out naturally, a reflex of her caregiver's instinct. And then, the dam broke. He told her about a gambling debt that haunted him, a stupid mistake from his youth in Atlanta that followed him like a shadow. He told her about the pressure of being the man Teresa thought he was, a successful and confident man, when in reality he felt like a failure, a fraud. The storm of his life was far more terrifying than the one raging outside. Martha listened in silence, her heart aching with a compassion that transcended logic. She didn't see her son-in-law, her daughter's husband. She saw a scared boy in the dark. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort, a mother's gesture. But when he turned and covered her hand with his, the gesture changed. The touch was no longer maternal. It was the touch of two castaways clinging to each other in the middle of a storm. The sound of the rain, the warmth of the candlelight, the smell of ozone in the air, it all blended into a moment of suspension. The space between them shrank. The line between comfort and desire, between right and wrong, became dangerously thin. And in that dark kitchen, to the sound of nature's fury, they crossed that line, not with words, but with a silence charged with an electricity that not even the strongest lightning could match. There was no violence, no coercion. There was only the collision of two desperate solitudes. It was an act born of weakness, confusion, and a human need as old as time itself. In the dim light of the kitchen, the outside world with its rules and judgments disappeared. All that remained was them, the storm, and a silence that said everything. For Martha, it was like awakening a body she thought was dead. Decades of widowhood, of self-denial, of a life devoid of touch and masculine affection, dissolved in that instant. She felt alive and terrified. The woman she was, Miss Martha, the matriarch, watched from a dark corner of her mind, horrified. But the other woman, the Martha who had been young, who had loved and been abandoned, emerged with overwhelming force. It was a betrayal of everything she believed in, of her daughter, of God, and yet, in that moment of transgression, she felt, paradoxically, seen, understood. For Andrew, it was a moment of surrender. He let down his guard, the mask of the perfect son-in-law, and allowed his vulnerability to be held. Martha was not the critical mother-in-law or his wife's mother. She was a woman who listened to him, who saw his pain, who offered him a safe harbor, even if that harbor was built on the shifting sands of sin. When the act was over, the storm outside began to subside. The heavy rain gave way to a gentle drizzle, and the sound of thunder became a distant rumble. Reality, cold and brutal, flooded the kitchen along with the first light of dawn. They pulled away from each other, and the chasm they had crossed now stretched between them, wider and deeper than ever. Shame was a heavy blanket suffocating them. Not a word was exchanged. What could be said? Andrew was the first to move. He got up, dressed in silence, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back, leaving Martha alone with the silence, the dying flame of the candle, and the crushing weight of what they had done. Martha remained there, sitting on the cold floor, for a long time. The sun rose, casting rays of light through the window, illuminating the dust in the air and the disarray in her soul. She felt dirty, defiled. The fleeting pleasure had been replaced by a corrosive guilt that burned in her stomach. She looked at her own hands, the same hands that had guided lives into this world, and saw them as the hands of a sinner. The storm had passed, but the devastation in her heart was just beginning. She had tasted the forbidden fruit, and now she knew she would have to live forever in exile from her own garden. In the days and weeks that followed that night, a heavy, artificial silence settled over the wooden house. Teresa returned from Montgomery the next day, radiant and oblivious, chattering endlessly about the preparations for her nephew, and bringing small gifts for her mother and husband. The normalcy of her presence was torture for Martha and Andrew. Every smile from her, every affectionate touch on Andrew, every kind word to Martha, was like salt in an open wound. Martha and Andrew developed a complex choreography to avoid each other. If he was in the living room, she stayed in the kitchen. If she went to the porch, he would lock himself in the bedroom. Meals were an exercise in tension, with forced conversations mediated by Teresa, who, in her innocence, failed to notice the undercurrent of guilt and resentment flowing between the other two occupants of the house. Martha threw herself into her work as a form of penance. She weeded the garden with a fury that left her hands raw. She scrubbed the floors until the wood nearly lost its finish. She attended church with a renewed fervor, sitting in the back pew, her head bowed, feeling the eyes of God burning into her neck. Every hymn about redemption sounded like an accusation. Andrew, for his part, grew even more distant. He spent more time on the road, making excuses for longer work trips. When he was home, he was sullen and irritable with Teresa, who couldn't understand the sudden change in his behavior. "What's wrong with Andrew, Mama?" she asked Martha one afternoon, her eyes welling with tears. "He barely speaks to me. He seems a million miles away." Martha's heart constricted. "He must be worried about work, dear," she lied, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. "A salesman's life isn't easy." It was a weak lie, but Teresa clung to it. The truth was unthinkable. The only communication between Martha and Andrew consisted of furtive glances, laden with accusation and shame. His gaze said, "This was a mistake. It was your fault." Her gaze replied, "We both made a mistake, and now we're trapped in it." The intimacy they had shared on that stormy night had transformed into its opposite, a mutual repulsion, fueled by the fear of discovery. They were accomplices in a nameless crime, chained to each other by a secret that poisoned them with each passing day. The silence in Martha Collins's house wasn't an absence of sound. It was a deafening noise, the constant thrum of guilt against the walls of their consciences. 2 months passed. Autumn arrived in Cedar Grove, painting the oak leaves in shades of rust and gold. Life seemed to have returned to a semblance of normalcy. Andrew continued to travel a lot, and Martha clung to her routine like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. She tried to convince herself that the night of the storm had been a lapse, a nightmare that time would erase, but her body began to send signals that the nightmare was far from over. First, it was a persistent fatigue, a weariness in her bones that not even a full night's sleep could alleviate. She blamed it on age, on the hard work in the garden. Then came the morning sickness, a wave of nausea that sent her rushing to the bathroom as soon as she woke. "Must be something I ate," she told herself, ignoring the voice of experience whispering in her mind. She was a midwife. She knew the signs as well as she knew the lines on her own hands. Then her breasts became tender, and her sense of taste changed. The smell of coffee, which she had always loved, suddenly became unbearable. And, most alarmingly, her menstrual cycle, which had always been regular as clockwork even in perimenopause, did not come. The dread began as a small, cold seed in her stomach, and grew into a tree of ice that took over her entire being. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. She was 58 years old. It was an age to be a grandmother, not a mother. It was an anomaly of nature, a cruel joke from God. She would look at herself in the bathroom mirror, the time-stained glass reflecting an image she barely recognized. She would lift her blouse, examining her abdomen. She saw a slight swelling, a subtle roundness that hadn't been there before. "It's the swelling of age," she would repeat aloud, as if the words could change reality. Many women my age get like this, but the midwife within her knew the truth. The woman within her refused to accept it. She lived in a torturous duality. By day, she was Miss Martha, the sensible woman who cared for her home and her daughter. At night, locked in her room, she was a terrified woman, counting the days, praying for a sign of blood that never came, a sign that it was all just a trick of her aging body. Denial was her only defense, a fragile wall she built brick by brick against a truth that threatened to flood and destroy everything she knew. But she knew, in the depths of her soul, that walls of denial do not stand forever, and the tide of reality was rising, slowly and inexorably. The certainty came on a full-mooned night, when she was already in the 3rd month of her silent torment. She woke in the dead of night with a strange sensation, a subtle flutter deep in her womb. It was an almost imperceptible movement, like the beating of a butterfly's wings. She froze in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She placed her hand on the spot, the skin still soft but firmer than before. She waited, holding her breath, and she felt it again. A small, unmistakable tremor. A life. There was a life growing inside her. A dry sob escaped her throat. It was not a sob of joy, like the ones she had so often witnessed in the young mothers she helped. It was a sound of pure despair. The last fragile wall of her denial crumbled, and the truth buried her. She was pregnant. Pregnant with her son-in-law's child. Pregnant with her daughter's husband's child. The world seemed to spin. She sat up in bed, her body trembling. The room, bathed in the pale moonlight, transformed into a prison cell. The shadows of the furniture were her judges. The silence of the house was her sentence. Every possible option flashed through her mind like ghosts. Tell the truth? Impossible. The shame would kill her. It would kill Teresa. It would destroy the family. Run away? To where? She had no money, nowhere to go. She was a woman of Cedar Grove, rooted in this land like the old oaks. And the pregnancy? Her stomach churned at the thought. She, who had spent her life bringing children into the world, who believed every life was sacred, how could she commit such an act? It would be the final damnation of her soul. There was no way out. She was cornered by biology, by morality, and by fear. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the moon-silvered yard. The world outside slept peacefully, ignorant of the hell raging within her. And in that moment of terrifying clarity, a decision began to form in her mind. A decision born of panic and the instinct for survival. If she couldn't escape reality, she would have to hide it. She would have to weave the greatest lie of her life. A lie so big, so audacious, that maybe, just maybe, people would believe it. She would have to become an actress, playing the part of Miss Martha while her body betrayed her day after day. The plan was vague, insane, but it was the only thing she could hold on to. She looked at her reflection in the window pane, at the silhouette of a woman carrying an impossible secret, and she knew that from that moment on, her life no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the lie she would have to maintain. The decision to hide the pregnancy turned Martha's life into a clandestine operation. Every day was a strategic battle against discovery. Her first weapon was her wardrobe. The dresses that once fit her waist were pushed to the back of the closet, replaced by loose-fitting smocks, aprons, and heavy shawls. Summer gave way to fall, and then winter, and the layers of clothing became her accomplices. If someone commented that she seemed to have gained weight, she would reply with a tired smile. It's age, dear. A body changes. Food became both her enemy and her ally. She forced herself to eat in front of Teresa and Andrew to avoid suspicion, but often felt sick in secret. At the same time, she used the excuse of a bad stomach to justify her paleness and her days of seclusion. Isolation became her fortress. She stopped going to church club meetings, inventing backaches. She ceased visiting her neighbors, claiming the winter cold ached her joints. The woman who had once been the center of the community now hid in the shadows of her own home. People missed her, but they attributed her withdrawal to her age. No one suspected the truth. The truth was simply too unbelievable. The biggest challenge was Andrew. He noticed the changes. He saw the looser clothes, The paleness, the withdrawal, fear began to appear in his eyes. On one of the rare occasions they were alone in the kitchen, he confronted her, his voice low and tense. "You're not well, Martha. What's going on?" Her heart raced. She turned away, her back to him, pretending to organize the pantry shelves. "It's nothing, just feeling under the weather." "Don't lie to me," he insisted, taking a step toward her. "Is it because of that night?" She whirled around, her eyes flashing with a fury born of panic. "There is no that night," she hissed. "That never happened. It was a storm, a delirium, and if you have any respect for your wife, for this family, you will never speak of it again." He recoiled, shocked by her ferocity. Her denial was so absolute, so powerful it almost convinced him. He saw that she had built a wall around the secret, and there was no getting through it. From that day on, he didn't ask again, but the fear and suspicion remained in his eyes, a silent threat Martha felt at her back at all times. She lived in a constant state of alert. The 6th, 7th, and 8th months passed in a blur of fear. The child moved within her, a constant physical reminder of her reality. Sometimes at night, she would place a hand on her swollen belly and feel a wave of forbidden tenderness. It was a part of her. It was innocent, and the instinct to protect that life mingled with the terror of its existence. She was weaving a web of lies, and the strongest, most dangerous thread in that web was the secret love she was beginning to feel for the child who could not, under any circumstances, be hers. As the end of the pregnancy neared, Martha's panic gave way to cold, desperate planning. Hiding her belly was one thing. Explaining the appearance of a baby was another entirely. She needed a story, a plausible story, one that would fit into the social fabric of Cedar Grove, a town accustomed to hardship and acts of Christian charity. The idea came one afternoon as she was flipping through an old church magazine. There was an article about families taking in the children of single, destitute mothers, and there, the seed of her great lie was planted. She began to weave the narrative subtly, planting it in fertile soil. The first person she spoke to was Mrs. Gable, her closest neighbor, and the town's biggest source of news. "My heart is so heavy, Elma," Martha said one day, as the two sat on the porch shelling peas. "I've been getting letters from a distant niece, up in Tennessee. A good girl, but she got mixed up with the wrong sort. She's pregnant, and all alone. The baby's father abandoned her." Mrs. Gable, as expected, was immediately interested. Her eyes lit up with the mix of compassion and curiosity that fuels small-town gossip. "Oh, my heavens, Martha. How dreadful. And what will she do?" "She doesn't know," Martha sighed, with the air of a woman burdened by the world's problems. "She's young, no way to raise a child. Talked about giving it up for adoption. It just breaks my heart to think of that little baby going to strangers." In the following days, Martha watered the seed. She mentioned the niece to the church pastor after the service. She spoke of the poor girl to the grocer. The story was always the same. A young relative, an unwanted pregnancy, an uncertain future for the baby. The community reacted as she had hoped, with pity for the unknown young woman and admiration for Miss Martha's compassion. No one questioned the details. Why would they? The story fit perfectly with the image they had of her, the charitable woman, the safe harbor for the helpless. The final piece of her charade was telling Teresa and Andrew. She gathered them in the living room one evening, her face a mask of solemn concern. "I need to talk to you both about something serious," she began, and told the same story she had been spreading around town. "I've been thinking and praying on it a lot. I can't bear the thought of that baby being given away. I was thinking, maybe we could take the baby in, raise it here as my own." Teresa, with her generous heart, hugged her mother immediately. "Oh, Mama, that's a wonderful thing to do. Of course we should. We'll help with everything." Andrew remained silent. His eyes were fixed on Martha, a mixture of horror, understanding, and a reluctant admiration for the audacity of her plan. He saw through the lie. He knew who the distant niece was, but what could he say? To deny it would be to confess. He was caught in her web. He simply nodded, his jaw tight. The lie was solidified. The false story had taken root in the community and within her own home. Martha now had a smokescreen, an explanation for the miracle or curse that was about to unfold. The stage was set for the final act of her long, lonely performance. The last few months were the hardest. The child grew strong, and hiding the movements and size of her belly became a constant challenge. Martha lived in fear of an accidental discovery, a hug from Teresa that was a little too tight, an unexpected bump at the grocery store. She moved with an exaggerated care, as if her body were made of glass. The nights were the worst. Alone in her room, she felt the life stirring within her. She would whisper to the child, asking for forgiveness for bringing it into a world of lies. She promised to love and protect it, even if that love had to live in the shadows. These moments of secret connection were her only source of comfort and her deepest source of pain. There was a day when it all nearly came undone. She was in the kitchen, and a plate slipped from her wet hands, shattering on the floor. As she bent down to pick up the pieces, a wave of dizziness hit her, and she nearly fainted. Teresa, walking into the kitchen at that moment, rushed to help her. "Mama, you're white as a sheet. You're not taking care of yourself." Teresa supported her, her hand landing firmly on her back, dangerously close to the curve of her belly. Martha stiffened, her heart in her throat. "I'm fine, dear. Just a dizzy spell," she said, gently pulling away. "This worrying about your cousin, it's been keeping me up at night." The lie, once again, saved her. Teresa accepted the explanation, the concern in her eyes replacing any suspicion. But the incident left Martha shaken. She realized just how fragile her charade was. She began preparing the scene for her niece's delivery. She gathered old sheets, bought gauze and alcohol from the town pharmacy, and hid them in a box at the back of her closet. To all appearances, she was preparing to act as a midwife for her distant relative. In reality, she was setting the stage for her own solitary birth. The wait was torture. Every day that passed was another day of risk. Another day the secret could leak out. She prayed for the child to come soon, and at the same time, she dreaded the moment it would arrive. The birth would not be a celebration, but an exchange of one prison for another. She would leave the prison of the secret pregnancy, only to enter the life sentence of a life built on a lie. Martha's long vigil was coming to an end, and she didn't know if what awaited her was salvation or damnation. And then, the night came. The night we revisited, but now with the weight of 9 months of fear and deception. The first pains began at dusk, subtle as a cramp. Martha knew what they were. Teresa and Andrew had gone to the movies in the next town, a rare outing alone that Teresa had insisted on. It was a blessing, an unexpected gift from fate that gave her the time and privacy she needed. When the contractions grew stronger, more regular, she put her plan into action. She locked the front and back doors. She turned off the lights in the house, leaving only the one in the kitchen on. She retrieved the box with the sheets and medical supplies from its hiding place. She spread an old plastic sheet on the floor, covering it with clean cloths. The pain was different from what she had felt with Nancy and Teresa. It was a solitary pain, without the comfort of a hand to hold, without a voice to encourage her. Each wave took her to a dark place within herself, a place where only she, the child, and the secret existed. She clung to the edge of the kitchen table, her breath hissing through her teeth, sweat soaking her nightgown. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her, its ticks loud and indifferent. The hours dragged on. She lost all sense of time, guided only by the growing intensity of the contractions. She was both patient and midwife, sinner and penitent. She used all the knowledge she had accumulated over the years, guiding her own body through the arduous and sacred process of birth. When the final moment came, she knelt on the floor, as we saw at the beginning, and bit down on the dish towel to muffle the scream that tore from her throat. And then, relief, the silence, and the cry. The sound of the baby girl's cry echoed in the silent kitchen. It was the most terrifying and most beautiful sound Martha had ever heard. She cut the umbilical cord with a sterilized pair of scissors, her hands trembling but steady. She cleaned the child with a damp cloth and wrapped her in a soft sheet. Holding the little one in her arms, exhaustion overwhelmed her. But as she looked at that tiny, wrinkled face, at the grayish-blue eyes that gazed back at her with an ancient wisdom, something inside her shifted. The shame and fear were still there, but they were momentarily eclipsed by an overwhelming wave of love, a fierce, protective love. She looked at the child, her daughter, her granddaughter, the symbol of her sin, and the proof of her humanity. "Your name will be Grace," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was a prayer, a hope that, despite everything, there might be some form of redemption for what she had done. She cleaned herself in the kitchen with what little energy she had left, erasing every trace of the birth. When Teresa and Andrew arrived, they found Martha sitting in the living room rocking chair, cradling a small bundle in her arms. "My niece's baby girl is here," she said, her voice exhausted but firm. The mother couldn't stay. She left her with me. She was born tonight. The lie was complete. The echo of the secret cry in the kitchen had transformed into the first word of a new life, a life that would begin and continue under the sign of deception. Grace's arrival was received in Cedar Grove exactly as Martha had planned. The church women brought casseroles and baby clothes. The pastor praised her from the pulpit for her Christian heart. The story of the distant niece was accepted without question, and Miss Martha was elevated to a new level of sainthood in the community's eyes. She was the woman who, in her old age, had taken on the burden of raising an abandoned child. The irony was so sharp that sometimes Martha felt she could bleed from it. Raising Grace was, for Martha, a mixture of profound joy and constant anxiety. The girl was a happy, healthy child, with a laugh that lit up the old wooden house. Martha loved her with an intensity that frightened her. It was a possessive, protective love, born of both motherhood and fear. Every time she looked at Grace, she saw a miracle, and she saw her secret, staring back at her with Andrew's eyes. The family dynamic became a labyrinth of unsaid emotions. Teresa fell in love with her niece, treating her like a younger sister or a borrowed daughter. She spent hours playing with Grace, teaching her songs, oblivious to the complex web of relationships that bound her to the child. To Teresa, Martha was a hero. For Andrew, Grace was a ghostly presence. He avoided her. He barely held her, barely looked at her. When the girl's eyes met his, he would look away, as if seeing a ghost. His distance was explained away by Teresa as the manner of a man who wasn't comfortable with children. But Martha knew the truth. Grace was the embodiment of his guilt, a constant reminder of his betrayal. Her presence in the house was torture for him, and his silent rejection was a knife in Martha's heart. Grace's life was built on whispers and half-truths. When she was little and asked about her parents, Martha would tell her the rehearsed story of a young mother who loved her very much, but couldn't take care of her. "She chose me to be your mother, my love," Martha would say, holding the girl tight, "because she knew no one in the world would love you more than I would." And that part, at least, was the purest truth. Years passed. Grace grew up in that house, loved by two women who were, in different and unknown ways, her mother, and watched from a distance by a man who was her father, but acted like a stranger. The wooden house of Martha Collins, once a place of routine and silence, was now a theater, where each resident played their part in a play whose tragic script only two of them knew. The years unfolded like the pages of an old book. Grace flourished, becoming an intelligent and curious young woman with Teresa's kindness and Martha's quiet resilience. To the world, and to herself, she was Grace Collins, the late-in-life daughter of the respected Miss Martha. The secret, with the passage of time, was buried under the layers of daily life. It ceased to be an open wound, and became an old scar, one that only ached when touched by memory. Martha grew old. Her hair turned completely white, her hands more gnarled, her steps slower. The energy she had once dedicated to the community was now all for Grace. She found a bittersweet redemption in her late motherhood. She taught Grace everything she knew about plants, about sewing, about life, and in every lesson, in every hug, she tried to compensate for the fundamental lie upon which the girl's life had been built. Andrew and Teresa continued their marriage. The distance between them never fully disappeared, but settled into a kind of resigned peace. They had their own children, 2 boys, who grew up treating Grace like a special older aunt. Andrew learned to live with Grace's presence, treating her with a distant, formal cordiality. He built a new wall around his past, a wall of normalcy and family routine. Sometimes Martha would catch him looking at Grace with an indecipherable expression, a mixture of pain, regret, and perhaps a spark of paternal love he could never express. Life in Cedar Grove followed its slow course. The people who knew the story of the niece grew old and died, and to the new generation, Grace was simply Miss Martha's daughter. The secret seemed safe, petrified by time. Martha almost convinced herself she could take the truth to her grave. She had raised a wonderful daughter. She had protected her family from shame. She had, in her own way, fixed what she had broken. She clung to this belief, to this fragile illusion of control. But buried truths have a way of finding their way back to the surface. They don't die. They just wait. And the calm that had lasted for nearly 2 decades in Martha Collins' life was just that. The deceptive stillness of the air before the long-delayed storm finally broke, and the first drop of rain, the first sign that the sky was about to fall, came in the form of a persistent cough in the chest of her daughter Teresa. Teresa's cough began as something harmless, a nuisance she attributed to a spring allergy. But the cough didn't go away. Instead, it worsened, becoming deep and painful. Then came the weight loss, the fatigue that left her breathless after climbing a flight of stairs. The visit to the doctor in Montgomery brought the news no one wanted to hear. Lung cancer. Advanced. Inoperable. The diagnosis fell upon the family like a death sentence. The facade of normalcy they had so carefully constructed over the years began to crack. Teresa's illness forced them all into a proximity they hadn't experienced in a long time. Andrew had to cut back on his travels to care for his wife. Nancy came from the other side of the county more often. And Grace, now a 20-year-old woman, dedicated herself to caring for the woman she believed was her aunt. Martha watched it all with a heart heavy with premonition. The pain of seeing her daughter wither away was unbearable, but another fear haunted her. Teresa's impending death was a catalyst, a force that was bringing everything hidden to the surface. The illness stripped Teresa of her defenses. In her body's fragility, her mind became sharper, more perceptive. She would spend hours in silence, observing the people around her, and her eyes, now large and deep in her gaunt face, began to see things her previous innocence had prevented her from seeing. She saw the way Andrew could barely look her in the eye, the guilt on his face that he could no longer hide. She saw the tension between her mother and her husband, an electric current of unresolved history that still crackled in the air after all these years. And above all, she saw Grace. She watched Grace care for her, with a devotion that went beyond a niece's love, and she saw the way her mother looked at Grace, with an intensity, a possessive love that was unmistakably maternal. One day, Grace was sitting by Teresa's bed, reading to her. The afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating Grace's profile. Teresa watched her, her eyes narrowed. "It's funny," Teresa said, her voice weak, little more than a whisper. "When the light hits you just so, you remind me of someone." Grace smiled. "Who, Aunt Teresa?" Teresa didn't answer. She just kept looking, her mind working, connecting dots that had been there all along, but which she had never dared to link. Grace's sudden arrival, her mother's reluctance to speak of the niece, Andrew's inexplicable distance, the pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed began to fit together, forming a monstrous, unbelievable picture. The crack in the facade had become a fissure, and the truth was starting to seep through. Teresa's last days were spent in a stupor, between consciousness and unconsciousness, mediated by the morphine that eased her pain. The family took turns by her side, keeping a silent vigil. One afternoon, the house was quiet. Teresa's sons were with Nancy. Andrew had gone to pick up more medicine from the pharmacy. It was just Martha and Grace in the room, sitting on opposite sides of Teresa's bed. Suddenly, Teresa's eyes opened, but they weren't cloudy as they had been for days. They were clear, focused. She looked first at Grace, with an intensity that made the young woman uncomfortable. Then, her gaze moved slowly until it met her mother's. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Teresa's labored breathing. "Mother," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Martha leaned forward, taking her daughter's cold hand. "I'm here, my love. I'm here." Teresa's eyes never left Martha's. She turned her head slightly, indicating Grace with her gaze, and then she uttered the words Martha had feared for 20 years. "She has his eyes, Mother," Teresa said, her voice a whisper laden with a devastating certainty. Andrew's eyes. Time stopped. The words hung in the air, irrefutable. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The final realization of a woman on the verge of death, who at last saw the world without filters, without illusions. Grace looked from Teresa to Martha, confused. "What do you mean, Auntie? Whose eyes?" But Martha wasn't listening to Grace. She could only stare into the eyes of her dying daughter, eyes that now held not just physical pain, but the pain of a lifelong betrayal. The lie she had so carefully constructed, that she had defended tooth and nail for 2 decades, had unraveled with a single look, a single sentence. All the air seemed to be sucked out of the room. The moment of truth, which she thought she could postpone forever, had arrived in the cruelest way possible. There was nowhere left to run. There were no more lies to tell. There were only her daughter's eyes, demanding the truth before they closed forever. Facing Teresa's gaze, Martha felt the weight of 20 years of deceit crash down upon her. The strength to lie abandoned her. All that was left was the truth, naked and ugly. Tears she had held back for decades finally began to roll down her wrinkled face. They were tears of guilt, of sorrow, of relief, and of pure terror. "Yes," Martha whispered, her voice broken. The single word was a full confession. Grace, standing by the bed, looked from one to the other, her face a mask of incomprehension. Yes, what? Mother, what is she talking about? But Teresa's eyes never left Martha's. How? She asked, her voice weak but sharp. When? And then, in a torrent of whispered words and sobs, Martha told her everything. The loneliness, the porch conversations, the night of the storm, the secret pregnancy, the birth in the kitchen, the lie about the niece, everything. The story she had kept locked in her heart for so long poured out in that sick room, poisoning the air. As Martha spoke, Grace's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to horror. The foundation of her life, the story of who she was disintegrating before her eyes. The woman she called mother was her grandmother. The woman she called aunt was her mother, and the man who was her distant uncle was her father. Teresa listened to it all in silence, her expression hardening. When Martha finished, drained and empty, Teresa took a deep, ragged breath. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her reaction was something far worse. It was an icy silence, a look of desolation so profound it seemed like an abyss. She looked at her mother, the woman who had raised her, who had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. Then she looked at Grace, the daughter she never knew she had, the sister who was the fruit of her husband's and her own mother's infidelity. With a final effort, Teresa squeezed Martha's hand. Why? She whispered, and the question held the weight of all the pain in the world. Martha couldn't answer. There was no answer that could justify such a betrayal. Teresa closed her eyes. A single tear ran down her temple and was lost in her hair. And then, her grip on Martha's hand slackened. Her breathing, which had been so difficult, simply ceased. In the ensuing silence, the sound of a violent sob broke the air. But it didn't come from Martha. It came from Grace, who took a step back, away from the bed, away from the woman she now no longer knew what to call. Martha's confession had not only revealed the truth, it had coincided with her daughter's last breath, sealing the moment with a tragic and irrevocable finality. Teresa's funeral was a somber, tense affair. The community of Cedar Grove came to pay their respects, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. But the truth, like water, always finds a crack to seep through. Andrew, upon returning from the pharmacy to find Teresa dead and Grace in a state of shock, knew immediately that the secret was out. The day after the funeral, without a word to anyone, he packed a suitcase, got into his car, and drove out of Cedar Grove forever. His escape was a silent confession for anyone who cared to understand. Grace's grief was an ocean. She had lost the woman she now knew was her mother, and in the same instant, the identity of her entire life. The sense of betrayal was so deep it suffocated her. She looked at Martha, not with hatred, but with a feeling of revulsion and estrangement. The woman who had raised her was now a stranger, a liar. A week after the funeral, Grace packed her bags. I can't stay here, she told Martha, her voice devoid of emotion. I don't know who you are. I don't know who I am. Everything in my life has been a lie. Grace, please, Martha begged, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. You are my child. No, Grace replied, shaking her head. I don't know what I am, but I'm not your child, and this is not my home. She left without looking back, leaving Martha completely alone in the wooden house that now felt like a tomb. The story, inevitably, spread through the town. No one knew the exact details, but Andrew's sudden departure and Grace's rejection of Martha were enough to fuel the gossip. The looks of admiration that once followed Miss Martha were replaced by whispers and looks of contempt. The neighbors who used to bring casseroles now crossed the street to avoid her. The church, which had been her refuge, became a tribunal of accusing stares. Martha reaped what she had sown. The fruit of her secret was not the security she had sought, but absolute loneliness. She had lost everything: her daughter, her granddaughter, her son-in-law, her reputation. She was back where she started, alone in the wooden house, but this loneliness was infinitely heavier. It was a loneliness not of circumstance, but of consequence, a deserved loneliness, and in the deafening silence of her days, she finally had time to confront the enormity of what she had done. Years passed. 8 years of an almost uninterrupted silence. Martha Collins, now 78, remained in the same house. Time had etched the story of her pain and regret onto her face. She lived a simple, almost monastic life. She tended to her chickens, her garden, and her flowers. She spoke more to God than to people, not asking for forgiveness. She felt she was beyond that, but seeking understanding. She never heard from Andrew again. She heard he had moved out west. Nancy, her eldest daughter, visited sporadically, out of a mixture of duty and discomfort. The relationship between them was cordial, but irreparably broken. Of Grace, she heard nothing for a long time, and that absence was her daily penance, the wound that never closed. Then, one spring afternoon, as the azaleas in Martha's garden exploded in color, a car she didn't recognize pulled up in front of her house. A woman got out. It was Grace. She was different. Older, of course, with lines of experience around her eyes, but with a calmness she hadn't possessed when she left. Martha stood frozen on the porch, her heart beating erratically. Grace walked slowly up the steps and stopped before her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. "I needed a lot of time," Grace said finally, her voice mature and steady. "Time to be angry, time to hate myself, time to understand." Martha just nodded, tears streaming freely. "I went to college. I became a nurse," Grace continued. "I see people at their worst every day. I see the messes that life makes. I see how good people do terrible things for complicated reasons. For love, for fear, for loneliness." She took a step forward. "What you did was wrong, Martha. It destroyed so many lives. Mine, Teresa's, yours." The way she used the name Martha was a blow, but an honest one. "But I also know that you loved me. You protected me the only way you knew how. A twisted and broken way, but it was love," Martha sobbed, a sound that came from the depths of her soul. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I'm so sorry." "I know," Grace said. And then, she did something Martha never thought would happen. She reached out her arms and hugged her. It was not an embrace that erased the past. The scars were still there, deep and permanent, but it was an embrace of acceptance, of grace, the grace that Martha had named and prayed for so long. They stood there, on the porch of the old wooden house, two women bound by a tie of blood and a story of pain and impossible love. The secret had been revealed, the shame had been faced, and in the end, what remained was not judgment, but the understanding that the human heart is a complex and mysterious territory, capable of the deepest betrayal and perhaps the most difficult of forgiveness. Martha Collins did not regret having loved, but having lived in hiding. Shame was a prison, and now, in the twilight of her life, time and the grace of a rediscovered child had finally set her free. Martha's story, like so many others, reminds us that life is rarely black and white. It is made of shades of gray, of difficult choices, and of hearts that err in search of connection. If this journey into the depths of the human soul touched you, if it made you reflect on the secrets we all carry, please leave your like and share your thoughts in the comments. And to continue unraveling the stories hidden behind closed doors and silent glances, subscribe to the channel, because every life has a story, and every story deserves to be told.